So Matthew Scarave is the guitarist of the Australian death doom band Inverloch, which features two of the original members from the influential band Disembowelment. After releasing a fantastic EP back in 2012, they're set to release their debut album Distance Collapsed on March 4th. Matt, how are we?
Hey man, how you going? I'm great, how are you?
Yeah, I'm really, really good. So I've got a few questions because to be honest, a bit of context from me. So I got into like a lot of all sorts of metal, extreme metal, and I came across you guys and I always thought you were amazing, and I was very disappointed that you guys only released a demo and an album. And then I was in a record store and I saw this EP sitting there, and I was browsing, and it said members of Disembowelment, and I was over the moon. That was your original EP, and I was so excited. So how about you tell us a bit about what made you get back together? I know it's only two of the members, but what made you actually get back together, start making music again?
Okay, well, it's kind of a long story, but for years and years and years, Paul and I had been going to shows, and people would chat to us and say, you should go out and play, you should reform, but we knew we could never reform the original band, and we always respected, the feelings of the other guys, that they weren't keen to get involved with extreme music again. Around the end of 2009, I think, it sort of occurred to me that perhaps I could put together a little tribute band, and asked Paul straight away and just said, look, do you want to go out and do actually initially we only wanted to do one show. I said, why don't we just do one show and I said, why don't we just see if we can get the old music together, see if we can put it together in a live context, because it had never been done before. And so we spent the best part of a year just working up arrangements of the old Disembowelment material, and it came together really nicely, and the band, the guys that we had to play with us were fantastic to work with and really enthusiastic. So we did that one show early 2011, and once the word sort of spread, there was a few video clips or whatever getting around on YouTube, and the word started to spread, and then I think we had an offer to play in Sydney, so we thought, we'll do one more show in Sydney, and then straight after that we actually had the offer to go and play in Europe at Roadburn, and we just could not turn that down. So on the back of that, we played a short run of shows in Europe, and whilst we were doing all that, your creative energy starts happening. You were playing with great people, and the vibe was so positive that new music started to just naturally happen. I just started writing, and to be honest, some of the Disembowelment material didn't feel perfectly suited to the live format, so I wrote a few pieces which ended up on the EP, and they were just to fill out the set and give it some dynamic contrast or logical sort of flow. Once we had that EP, or the material coming together for an EP, we resolved that doing a tribute band was a finite idea. We knew we had to stop it after a few shows, so I said, well, we're having a good time, why don't we just release the new material under a whole new band name, and we'll just sort of start again, do it all fresh and just start again from the ground up. So we recorded with Joel Taylor here in Melbourne, and to be honest, we just treated that EP like a demo. Relapse heard it, and immediately they just said, we want to put this out. So from there, that's basically how Inverloch began. It all grew out of there.
That's really incredible. I mean, the surprising thing in doing some research for this interview was the fact that you had actually never performed live. So what? Given the fact that you had never performed live, what was the impetus to sort of say, we have this music, but we actually want to put it in the live setting, even though that had never been done before? Yeah, well, look,
initially it was really just the fact that so many people kept saying to us at shows, why don't you go and play, and after a while you think to yourself, it would have been nice to see what it would be like. So it was partly just curiosity, and just putting the band together that we had, and even rehearsing the songs up in the studio was an interesting enough experience. And we thought, well, it definitely seemed to have something going for it, so let's give it a try. So we just did that first show, and I have to say, we probably wouldn't have continued, but unless the fact that the crowd in Melbourne, the Melbourne scene was just so supportive. They understood where we were coming from and why we were doing it. But, there wasn't some big cash in or any kind of, thing like that behind it. It was just integrity, and we just wanted to have some fun. So we got a bunch of great bands to play with us, and the success of that show just really kicked it all off, and the people really enjoyed it. There was a lot of people that must have really liked that old material, and were just curious to hear what it sounded like live, same as we were. And for Paul and I, it was just a great experience. And the other guys loved it too. They got a real kick out of doing that. It was a big ask for them to put that together, and they handled it beautifully, and it all grew from there.
Awesome. Now, in terms of the new album, how is it how would you describe it in terms of, generally moving on some sort of dust subside, which, as you said, is more, in some ways, you sort of treat it as a demo. How has it sort of moved on from there, would you say? Yeah,
well, it's definitely, I would have to say that the music is far more, it's developed its own sort of sonic imprint. My writing style's, I guess, a little bit different, although I was still fairly involved in the past, back in the old band. But I think we've just definitely clarified the ideas, and I found a way to... I knew the sound that I was looking for from the very first first couple of recordings. I knew exactly what I wanted to achieve with this record, and the sound that I was going for, and the feeling that I wanted to get. So the sound has evolved by just sort of refining every element, refining the compositional process and refining the recording process and improving on everything. I wanted to put out a record that, that sounded like we worked really hard, and that we wanted to have that big, ethereal kind of monolithic production. I wanted it to sort of be the kind of production that late at night you could sink into. You could, whether you're listening with headphones or whether you've got, listening to it on your stereo at home, that you can really get absorbed into, and it's almost like watching a movie. For me, that's the impact I want to have. Whether or not people take it up, I don't know, but I'd love for people to immerse themselves in the soundscape. So I think of it as a singular statement, although it's a recording made up of five songs or 5 pieces of music. It's for me, it's very much a singular piece of music.
So where does that come from? That idea that, I think it was, I can't remember the exact words, but I remember I think it was the press statement that was sort of used the words like haunting and dreadful. I know to some people that might sound very, very sort of negative, but I think that almost captures it. Where does that come from, the idea that you want to have this sort of, I guess, in some way, sort of melancholic but epically heavy sound? Where does that desire come from, do you reckon?
Well, I think that a lot of that just comes from the influences that we've had growing up. Or a lot of the bands and albums that I think of, or music that's been inspiring, has that element about it. Whether it's just really dark, sonorous kind of ambient music, which is very linear and textural, or whether it's some of the great albums like that first Cathedral album, or you think of an album like Leprosy from Death, or Candlemass's Nightfall, or Early Sabbath, or albums that they have that monolithic kind of presence about them. That there's been a lot of effort put into the recordings, and so for me, I don't know why, but it all ties in very naturally. It's not anything that I've ever had to force. I don't know if anybody's very familiar with the Trial of the Bow material that we did back in the 90s, but that was Renato from Disembowelment and myself, and that's much more of an ethno-ambient kind of a thing. So it's really just fusing the elements together, but it always feels very natural. It's never contrived. It's never, juxtaposed or just slamming things one on top of the other. I don't know, man. It's like I like to, create a sonic picture and a soundscape. It's kind of like I said, I use that term again of movies, but it's not a bad analogy in some ways, because that's the way I approach it.
One thing I'm always curious, because I ask a few people who make music. I was interviewing a band that makes sort of music which combines symphonic elements with very sort of aggressive death metal. And one thing I'm always curious about, and I don't really have the answer, is why do these elements go together? Because intuitively, I think if you put that to a lot of people, they would say, no, that's ridiculous. They shouldn't go together, like ambient and death metal. Yet the way you and other bands fuse them is so magnificent.
Well, I appreciate you say that. I mean, look, I probably steer away from these so-called symphonic elements because I think that, look, I've studied music pretty in depth at university and been really fortunate to do that. It does, look, I tell you where I think the relationship sort of stems from the contrasting elements. If you think, I don't know, I mean, you know, I'm a big fan of listening to, you know, big epic sort of symphonic pieces, like take a Wagnerian piece, you know, and Wagner's a great example perhaps of, you know, like somebody who knew how to combine all these different elements and create a huge set of the soundscape and treated the orchestra like a whole instrument. Well, you know, in the same way, just because this is a sort of a simpler style of music, you can still create that same sonic soundscape, and all the elements can tie in together if you hear it as one singular piece. And I guess that's kind of the best way I can describe it, that it's just fusing different logical elements together to create that one big soundscape.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, in terms of Distance Collapsed, you know, it has those sort of disparate elements. Kind of, it moves from more aggressive parts to more melancholic parts. Did you ever find it difficult to balance out those elements, not to sort of lean too heavily on one side? Because I feel like it's a very sort of, as you contemplate it as a whole, I think it kind of works sort of holistically. Was there any difficulty sort of achieving that balance?
It can be. I appreciate. Yeah, it's nice to hear you say that you're aware of that. The balance is something that I'm very conscious of, and I think the longer you spend time, you know, at my age, I've been involved with this music now for a really long time, since I was 16, 17, I'm like in my mid-40s now. You learn a lot as you go, and if you've studied the music, if you understand it and listen to it for long enough, it sort of embeds itself in your own DNA. So what I'm trying to say is that you combining and balancing out the dynamic flow of a record, it kind of makes sense to you when you look at the bigger picture. And I think just writing music and the practice of writing and recording music, along the way you sort of learn how to make the record ebb and flow, how to give it that dynamic contrast, and how to sort of try to balance it up. Now, having said all that, you sort of just let the songs develop in their own way anyway. You don't, you know, you're in control, but the songs have their own way of. I guess it's a little bit like painting a picture. To a certain degree, it's got to be just a natural thing, but you're still in control of that, and so you have to work hard. That's where the work comes into it. Is you've got to be really disciplined with yourself, and in the end, you can discard and throw away a lot of material that, you know, in some ways you might really like it, but you don't use it because it's just not right for that record. Now, a great example is that the final song off the album, Cataclysm of Lacuna, that actually functioned as much as it's sort of an outro too for the record, or it's an ending to the record. There's an intro for the record that never made it onto the album that uses a lot of the similar material that's in the outro, so they bookended the record. But I didn't put it on the record for the release because it just didn't feel right dynamically. So, you know, they're the decisions you make along the way, and you've got to be your own critic, and you've got to think about, what do I want to hear? You know, when I listen to the music, what's going to sound inspiring, what's going to sound appropriate. So you've got to take a bit of the ego out of the whole picture and just look at what you think is going to benefit the record. And hopefully we got it right, but you never can tell.
For one voice, I think you got it right.
Thank you, mate.
So, going back to sort of the earlier days, Disembowelment, now, bands have this tendency, which I think is almost universal, but I think annoys people who interview them, that they tend to downplay their influence a lot. And I've seen some of you and some other it might have been you, sort of saying we don't think we're that influential, we don't feel that we're influential. Do you, given the response, me, other people, I think Decibel put it as the top 20 can't wait albums. Do you sort of get that? Like, wait, we did actually make something that was really influential, and people, it still has impact on people today.
Look, if you'd asked me 5 or 10 years ago, I probably would have definitely played it down for sure. I think now I'm more accepting of the fact that if people connected to it, that's just something that I should be proud of that we're involved with. So, I think I think it's that simple, really. That if the early material meant a lot to a lot of people out there, and we've met people all around the world now that have said the same kind of thing. Okay, well that's fantastic, and I'm glad that they've had a positive experience with it, and that's awesome. I mean, it's very humbling, and we're super lucky to have such nice comments and people saying cool stuff. At the same time, that can make things tricky too, when you start doing things again, because there's all kinds of bizarre expectations, and you get the classic sort of nostalgics that sort of wish maybe you weren't doing that too, that you could just, I've heard you get the occasional remark of, oh, maybe you should just sort of leave it where it is, kind of a thing. But we sort of feel like Inverloch's a new vehicle. It's a new beast of its own. So we just let it happen. I mean, this is just kind of who we are. It's what we do. I think the new material is different to the old material, but I'm glad people vibe off the old material. That's really cool, and I'm just really thankful for that. And I'm thankful for the opportunities that it's given us now too. So it's pretty simple, really.
Also, in terms of the early days, I kind of like... It's always hard to measure these things, People tend to go, oh, that band did it first, that band did it first. But I feel like death metal, doom metal was already sort of there and kind of up and coming. But I feel like you guys kind of added to that a bit, kind of were exploring the territory, adding the kind of more ethereal aspects in certain ways. Did you feel like you were exploring new territory in any way?
Yeah, look, that was one of the things I've got to pay respect to Renato for too, with Disembowelment, and Jason as well, because they had a good vision, and when I came into Disembowelment, late in '91, I was, me and Renato hit it off early on at gigs because we were talking a lot about dark ambient sort of music, and we'd never met other people in the scene that were into the same stuff, so that just sort of drew us together inevitably. There was a definite feeling that the whole concept behind, the premise behind Disembowelment, in fact, oddly enough, even the name, the guys, we agreed at some point we wanted to change the band name from Disembowelment because it seemed a little bit cliched, and we were always trying to step away from cliches, at the time. And in fact, most bands at the time were like that. Everybody was looking for their own identity. That was the big thing. Even if you were doing it on a really underground level, just recording demo tapes on cassette and whatever, the big thing was finding your own sound, finding your own identity. And fusing those ambient, and early on with Disembowelment, if you ask me, there was a fairly industrial and cold kind of a sound in there as well. But it became much more of a sort of an ambient, elegant sort of approach by the time we did the record. And I guess we felt like we were on to something that was a little bit unique. And certainly that recording, if you listen to it, we did things very differently to what everybody else did. We kept the guitars very much as almost like a sonic texture rather than a dry kind of driving riffing sort of a thing, which a lot of death metal bands did. We put melody to the front, front and centre, and we used a lot of reverb in those days. And it gives it that sort of really dark underground sort of quality. And the poor engineer that was recording us in those days had no idea what was going on, man. He just, he'd done some great metal recordings and thrash and even early death metal, but he really struggled with us. And so we basically produced it ourselves and did the best we could. And we loved it, man. At the time, we were just so excited to have that kind of sound. And it certainly wasn't for everybody. But that's often the way it is when you're sort of pushing into new territory. It'll turn a lot of people away, but there was a little core of people there that I think liked it too.
One thing that amused me, I think it's the Cannibal Corpse documentary about their sort of up and coming into whatever point they released it, and they talk about when they were first starting, the engineers just had absolutely no idea what to do, because it was sort of sort of playing music in such a kind of dense way that they just weren't prepared at all for it.
Oh yeah, no, that is so true. You know, and now that was both a blessing and a curse in some ways, because we struggled, of course, to get it down, but at the same time it helped us actually find a sound that didn't really exist. And I still think if you listen to that early Disembowelment material, it does sound kind of different to a lot of material that's around at that time. And I think it was, in hindsight, a blessing. You know, that was a really good thing. And I think that should be that's an important facet for any young band. You know, you got to find your own sound and find your own way and not be afraid. We were so, in those days, we were so 100% clear and stoic on what we believed in and the kind of sound we were pushing for. And we never wavered on it. And I think that's a good basis to work from.
Returning back to the album, I'm curious about, this is used in the previous EP as well. What's the significance of the vertical bar between Distance Collapsed and the previous EP Dusk Subside? What's the significance of that?
Well, we were using a two-word phrase for the original title, and we were heading that way. And actually, that was Paul's idea. He came up with this idea of sort of splitting the two words like that, and visually it looks great. And it's sort of, even phonetically, I suppose, if that's the right way of saying it, it just sort of it felt right with the Dusk Subside. And, you know, with the EP, we were basically saying, you know, this is the end of the Dusk project, it's gone. And so splitting it is not so much of a deep thing, but we thought that it sat really nicely visually and graphically. And so we maintain that when we're trying to come up with ideas for the new album title. We thought, that makes a lot of sense, you know, to maintain that with the record. It's got like a little thematic thing going on, so it's pretty straightforward.
Fair enough. In terms of the graphics, it's funny, I think I've struggled with a lot of the people I've interviewed to actually identify what the album cover artwork is. What is it of for Distance Collapsed?
Oh, I almost don't want to say, because it's sort of fun to have different ideas going on behind it. But Orion Landau, who does a lot of graphic design for Relapse, he came up with that idea. There is actually, without giving too much away, there's like a little trilogy theme in our album cover. So the first EP is very sort of foresty and land-based and very dark and green. This time we wanted something dark and textural that complemented the music. And if you look in certain ways, it almost looks like a watery sort of a thing. So I'll leave it at that. You know, I'll let everybody sort of make their own mind. It's good if you see the vinyl, the album cover, when it comes out, because it's really striking. And tonally, it's not. It doesn't seem, sort of colour-wise, it doesn't look so watery. But if you have a look at the textures, it's quite dense and flowing and rippling. And I really like that analogy visually to the music. You know, I think it complements what's happening musically very well.
Now, in terms of, I mean, a lot of bands these days seem to be pushing the envelope in terms of speed and technicality. I've noticed, you know, the last 5 years, a lot of technical death metal bands trying to be the most intricate band they kind of can be, and trying to be as fast on the guitar as possible. But I don't know if, like, I'm not a great guitar player at all. But is it difficult to also play slowly, to be precise and kind of really stay in time with the music that you have outlined?
100%. You know, I tell you, I think that's one of Paul's strongest suits as a drummer, his ability to maintain his composure and relax and maintain the tempo when we're playing live, man, he really controls that tempo, and sometimes he pulls it right back, and you kind of like, you start smiling to yourself because you're like, Jesus, how slow this is going to, it must feel like it's going to fall over any minute. And especially because it contrasts out of some of the old school sort of blasts that we do. Playing slow and tight is a whole discipline of its own, yeah, for sure. And it takes a lot of work, like anything else, So, and I know Mark, our other guitarist, he comes from a thrash and death metal background, so for him, he had to really work on just concentrating on his slow phrasing and then just maintaining the pulse. And you can. It's pretty hard when you go super slow, but it's also a lot of fun because you've really got to trust in each other, and you've got to be locked in, and you've got to be listening. So it's hard, but I love the fast playing, and I love hearing young bands just tearing it up as well. That excites me every bit as much as playing slow.
In terms of your lyrical inspiration, I believe you co-wrote the lyrics with your vocalist. Mm-hmm. Where do you get the sort of inspiration from them? Because they're very sort of contemplative in a kind of a morbid sort of way, if that's the right phrasing.
Yeah, they are. I think what we sort of know, it's easier for us to know what we don't want to get, what sorts of lyrical content we don't want to get into, so we steer away from anything religion-based. We steer away from sort of childish, cliche kind of gore-type lyrics and that. So, eventually it tends to become a little more introspective and thoughtful. We will, some of Ben's lyrics, as we go through them, they'll be either very simple. There might be the odd song there that's composed of sort of, maybe no more than 8 to 12 lines and phrases that he'll work through songs. Or then there are other much more elongated lyrics. Some of them are inspired by just different forms of literature, poetry and stuff like that we'll read, and that's where Distance Collapse came from. That was kind of inspired by a Russian poet from the last century. And yeah, it's just, I would agree that they're far more introspective lyrics, and we treat them very seriously, but we kind of like to leave it off. We've never really printed our lyrics, and thus far, and I don't see us doing it any time in the future, because I'm not sure. I don't know. I suppose there are some listeners that might feel that it adds to the package, but we tend to let the vocals be part of the sonic soundscape too. So whilst they have meaning and impact for us, and we still very much treat it as telling a story in the song, but and the recordings and live. Ben's a great storyteller, but we've never published the lyrics, and probably keep it that way. And yeah, I don't see that changing just yet.
Fair enough. I think, it's definitely with this latest album, you can probably be called kind of one of the better metal artists, or releasing really great music in Australia. And I'm always kind of surprised by the fact that we're a country of 20 million, we're nowhere near metal saturation of some of the European countries, yet we produce a lot of, I feel at least, good records, records to be proud of. Do you think there's anything particular about Australia that allows us to do that?
Yeah, a lot of people ask that same question. How do you get such quality coming out of a small population? But I'll tell you, I think that the underground fans here, well, fans of just metal, let's just say, it doesn't have to be about the underground. I think people here are very much students of the whatever given genre that they like. They don't just listen to the music, but they absorb it. They go to shows, they play, and I think they take it really seriously here. So, and I think Australians are very, very comfortable to look for their own sound too. So I think one of the great things about this country is that we've been able to produce bands that work pretty hard to find their own sound, and it is always really high quality. And I think we punch well above our weight in that respect. If only bands could stay together long enough and, just have more opportunities or create more opportunities to get overseas and play, they could even have greater success. But it's just hard, distance and logistics make it really difficult. But there's no reason why. Look, it should be the same for anywhere in the world, but I think the bands here are just super passionate about their chosen genre that they like, and they throw themselves in at 100%. It's always been that way, I mean, that's the whole reason that we got started playing, because there were such good bands. I remember a band called Persecution from the late 80s, very early 90s, and they were sort of I think there's a record coming out that's made up of some old demos from theirs, and it's like some of the heaviest stuff, man, and live, they were phenomenally heavy live band and tight, just incredible. And they were a massive influence on Disembowelment and all of us guys in the early days. It's always been that way. There's always been great bands, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. I think that'll just keep going.
Cool. 2 more questions. I know you've got a couple of dates in Europe over the next few months. Is there any plans to play any Australian shows after that?
We have a show here in Melbourne in May for a small festival here in May, playing with Mournful Congregation.
Oh wow, that would be amazing seeing you.
Yeah, that's happening in May. We love to play with Mournful. They're an amazing band, and any time that sort of opportunity comes along, we usually go, oh, okay, yeah, we'll play with Mournful playing. And I think Cruciform are playing as well. So that'll be a really strong lineup. That's in May in Northcote in Melbourne, and then beyond that, we're playing, I think, the Dark Mofo Festival down in Tasmania for the Mona Arts Festival, and that's going to be really interesting because I believe there's 2 or 3 international acts just coming for that particular festival down in Tassie. So, and I think we're lucky enough to be the only Australian band playing with that. So that's all extreme music, all death metal and extreme, maybe a black metal band's coming as well. So sit tight on that. That festival in Hobart's going to be really, really interesting. That's all I've got planned for at this stage. Maybe another show later in the year, but we're conscious of not playing too often in Australia. Maybe, or at least we don't want to always play in Melbourne. We sort of like to spread it out now a little bit and make it worthwhile for punters to come out and check it out.
Finally, I like to get people's sort of perspectives on this, and I know it's an incredibly difficult question, but do you have any favourite bands, metal? Favourite albums, metal or non-metal? And if you can't come up with one, they're just general sort of bands that you think are really top.
You mean just in general throughout, my listening sort of life?
Yeah, whatever.
Oh, wow. Favourite bands for me, or favourite albums? Yeah, off the top of your head, that's always really difficult. But I can go right back to, I always think of certain years, and for me, as a 14-year-old, 86 was just like a stellar year. So, that to me was a real pinnacle year for thrash. And I used to listen to a lot of thrash in those days. And I remember I used to listen to Pleasure to Kill, Creator's Pleasure to Kill all the time. Possessed Beyond the Gates back in the day, they were all huge albums. Getting away from metal, the whole Harold Budd collection, the ambient composer, I grew up listening to that stuff. So, I've always really, really loved that sort of sonic, textural kind of sounds a little synthy, I suppose, these days, but the compositions themselves are remarkably good. And, I studied classical guitar growing up, so there's a lot of great guitar composers. I tell you what, I'd say to anyone, if you're into guitar and if you're into really beautiful music, check out the Ross Edwards Guitar Concerto. Ross Edwards is an Australian composer, and the middle movement of that is just phenomenally dark and beautiful. And I think Dead Can Dance, another Australian group, they were a big influence on me for a long time. So there's a couple there, all very, very contrasting and different.
One more question I'll actually come up with, if you don't mind.
Yep.
How did you get into sort of Trash and Ambient. I'd be interested to hear about that.
It's like anybody else, man. I was the youngest of 4 siblings, so, I had a brother that was like 15 years older than me who was into, Deep Purple and Alice Cooper, and I had my mother was like a big Pink Floyd fan in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, so I grew up listening to that. One of my sisters was a big ambient fan, so I grew up, you just absorb all this stuff from your siblings. And metal was just the thing that I found as a young, I think I got given a Motorhead tape when I was like 12, and from there, it all just clicked into place. So it's contrasting and it's kind of mad, but I think a lot have more of a eclectic taste than they're willing to let on.
Oh,
I was just lucky that mine weren't sort of shitty pop music or anything like that. I just had no idea what any of that music was, and man, I'm really glad of that. It's always been one of the best things I think in my life, is I just had no knowledge of what pop music is and what was going on in that world.
Inverloch are set to release their debut album, Distance Collapsed, on March 4th. Matt, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks so much, Ben. I really appreciate the time, and I hope everybody enjoys the new record, and give it a spin and see what you think, and keep your mind and ears open, and hopefully it'll strike a chord with everybody. Really looking forward to it being out there.